The Pittsburgh Steelers have been active in free agency, and especially at the linebacker position, where not only did they get two guys, but they let go of the guy who led the team in tackles last year in Miles Jack. To talk about me with that is Brian Batko, our Steelers beat writer. I'm your host, Chris Carter, of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We'll talk about that, where the Steelers have been on pro days. They visit Ohio State on Wednesday, another in the long list of places that the top brass have visited, and how it impacts their draft plans, or at least the outlook on them. We'll talk about all that and more right here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Brian Batko, one of our esteemed Steelers beat writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. You can get all of our content at post-gazette.com, where we're covering everything, not just sports, but all the news that you need to get in the greater Pittsburgh area. Also, if you want to subscribe to this show, you can do so on all your favorite podcasting apps, but especially on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it on YouTube. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes and all the daily content that doesn't just involve this show, but all of the different shows that we do here for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Thanks for tuning in again. We've got Brian back, and Brian, I was out gallivanting across the country covering ACC tournaments and March Madnesses and combines and stuff. Meanwhile, you guys were pretty busy here watching all the changes that the Steelers front office went through, and it seemed like you didn't have too much time to slow down yourselves.
Yeah, I mean it's been a busy week or so of free agency. It seems like now here on Wednesday, maybe things are going to slow down a little bit. You know, they haven't officially announced the DeMonte KZ re-signing yet. I assume that's a formality, but other than that, yeah, I mean everybody's in the fold, and maybe they'll make some more kind of minor moves. But it seems like it continues to be a big topic of discussion among Steeler Nation. I put a tweet out there the other day that essentially listed all their outside free agent signings from this time last year versus this year, and asked if people think the Steelers are being more aggressive or if it's just been business as usual. And honestly, I think the responses are kind of split 50-50. So that makes for an easy, actually, if you can see this glass, it says half empty or half full. That's kind of the, and also I'm going to take a sip of coffee when I'm done talking, but also that's kind of illustrating, what Steelers fans are seeing right now when they look at this approach to the offseason.
I agree with that there's always a split because people are going to feel how they're going to feel about different free agent signings. I've talked about the offensive line and stuff with Ray Fittipaldo. We did that a lot on Monday and Friday. I wanted to talk to you about the linebackers because you wrote a piece for the Post-Gazette about Elandon Roberts and what he brings to the Steelers outside of just his skill set as a linebacker, but also as his experience with the Patriots and how he kind of came up in the NFL and what he brings to the table for the Steelers. The Steelers made pretty much a wholesale change in their linebacker core. Miles Jack has been cut. Devin Bush was let go at free agency. He's now with the Seahawks.
Wearing a big hat.
What'd you say?
Wearing a big hat. Did you see the hat he was wearing when he signed with the Seahawks?
Oh, I missed this picture. Was he wearing really like? Because a lot of players are doing that, and that's a trend I do not get. I try to keep up on stuff, but when players do stuff like that, I'm like, I don't get it. What's happening?
It's like a beanie, but he kind of he's got a little bit of a fro, so it's like a beanie that is wide enough to cover his fro. It's not quite the draft night suit for Devin Bush, but it was an interesting fashion choice all the same in his first day as a Seahawk. I guess that's kind of his thing.
That is interesting. But he's with the Seahawks. Robert Spillane is with the Raiders. And so all you have left is Mark Robinson, which means Omar Khan and Andy Waddle had to get busy. They went and brought in Elandon Roberts from the Dolphins, also formerly from the Patriots. They also went and got Cole Holcomb from the Washington Commanders, both guys who wore captain patches on their chests last season for their respective teams. But part of what you talk about with Elandon Roberts is that captain experience, or like that captain like mentorship level that he had for the Dolphins. It's something he picked up from the Patriots, and I think it could be vital for the Steelers as they try to rebuild their linebacker group.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Chris. I think you just look at the production alone and what the Steelers linebackers did, and more specifically did not do on the field last year. I mean, we've been over it many times. 0 takeaways for that group combined. I mean, maybe part of that is how they were being asked to play. but I wouldn't say there were a ton of big hits against the run or anything like that either. It just seemed like with the lack of production from that group, Steelers front office and coaching staff kind of just said, look, everything must go. Other than Mark Robinson, everything must go. We need to make this over here, by necessity, by choice, whatever you want to say. And that has been how they've approached things this offseason. And when you look at, the linebacking core, really since the Ryan Shazier injury, I mean, it just seems like there hasn't been a true leader among that group, or I guess I should say since Vince Williams abruptly retired a couple years ago. I mean, he was initially released and then was going to come back. And then if you remember, he didn't right before training camp, decided I'm done with football, basically. Since his departure, there hasn't been a clear-cut leader in that group. I think Miles Jack, he was a veteran. He brought some much-needed experience and seasoning to the linebackers last year. But I think he was kind of along for the ride in a way, and he was decent, but obviously couldn't stay healthy, and wasn't playing at the same level by the end of last season. So their backloaded contract allowed them to get out from under him, and they did. Cole Holcomb, I think, is going to be the green dot every down guy, provided that he's healthy, and I have no reason to think that he isn't after passing his physical. So that's what they're going to want to see out of him. And now, that brings us to, like you said, Elandon Roberts, who I wrote about on Monday after he did a pretty lengthy Zoom call with us, which is always appreciated. A guy comes into a new team and he's willing to sit down with the media in person or otherwise and kind of explain his thinking, picking the Steelers. He was really high on Mike Tomlin. But what I was most struck by was he's kind of going to bring a grown man mentality to the middle of the defense, which I just don't think they've had. Now, I don't think he's going to be playing every snap. I think his skill set, such as it is, he's going to be in a box a little bit, literally and figuratively. I think he'll be first and second down, play against the run, get off blocks and smash people. Mike Tomlin's been looking for a linebacker like that for I don't know how long at this point. So, so I think Roberts is, he's a stopgap. He's not going to be some long-term solution. I don't even know that he'll be here a year from now because it's yet another, backloaded deal that the Steelers hand out to a player who's probably closer to the end of his career than the beginning. But, he's got an attitude and a mentality that was shaped in the NFL by those Patriots teams where he won 2 Super Bowls. Players like Dante Hightower, who literally just retired yesterday. The McCourty brothers, obviously, Bill Belichick from the top down there. Brian Flores was very influential when Elandon Roberts and eventually wanted to bring him over to Miami, which he did. So I think that could be a good thing, just from a locker room and meeting room perspective, even if he's not going to be somebody who is a huge upgrade in terms of what he's bringing to you on the field. Although he could be. We'll see. Again, glass half empty, glass half full. I'm going to take another sip.
There you go. Take another sip of the coffee so you can keep getting juiced up. But Brian, I think it's another thing to look at here is also what you talked about earlier about Miles Jack and how he was brought in and he was fine. He wasn't a bad player for the Steelers. He led them in tackles, and I think
he was a splashy signing when they made it last year. Much bigger name at this time last year than Cole Holcomb or Elandon Roberts. Let's just be honest about that.
Absolutely, and in that way, he was a disappointment, especially because he was making a whole bunch of money, and if the Steelers hadn't let him go, I think he was a $13 million cap hit.
Yeah, I think so.
You can't spend $13 million on a defensive player that doesn't create turnovers in this system or isn't a sack producer. And if you're doing something like that, I think that's going backwards, and I think that's what the Steelers are looking at. So instead of keeping Miles Jack, the Steelers went and got 2 linebackers that can kind of fill the role of being just hey, you're just here to stuff the run, be responsible, don't be way out of your gaps, and kind of be those guys over the middle. I want to talk with Brian more in a minute about what that means for what the Steelers are trying to do on defense, not just at linebacker, but as a whole, and what they might be doing with the NFL draft. Plus, we'll have some Pro Day talk. Stick with us. We'll be right back here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with our Steelers beat writer, Brian Batko. Brian, when the Steelers bring in the linebackers that they have, but they haven't brought in anyone else, one, they could bring someone else if they wanted, and they could even do so after the NFL draft. But I do think it leaves the door open for getting another linebacker in this NFL draft class, though notably, a lot of people have said this isn't the best linebacker draft class. But I think there's a good group of guys that they could get potentially with a day 2 pick, namely Jack Campbell of Iowa, Dion Henley of Washington State, Drew Sanders of Arkansas, Trenton Simpson of Clemson. Those are 4 of the bigger names that I've kind of kept an eye on in this draft class. But with these 2 guys being more like run heavy type of off ball linebackers, are the Steelers kind of resigned to needing a guy that's going to help more in coverage, or should they kind of just make that, hey, when you come and play off ball linebacker for the Steelers, you're thumpers, you're going in, you're stuffing the run, and we'll let the secondary handle the coverage part?
Yeah, I mean, and even adding Mark Robinson to that, I think he is much more see ball, get ball, and he's on the undersized side of things, like Elandon Roberts. I think that's enough. I think E-Rob, I don't know if anybody calls him that, but I think E-Rob can mentor Mark Rob in this linebacker group. Maybe they still think Mark Robinson is a year away, or what's the famous NBA draft Fran Fraschilla comment? This guy's a year away from being a year away. You hope that's not the case with Mark Robinson, because then he's basically going to be on his way out before he ever develops. But they knew he was a project. He's a 7th-round draft pick. You don't bank on anything there. I think they threw him in at the end of last season, more so out of necessity than anything else. But I'm not giving up on Mark Robinson just yet. However, to your point, Chris, if he does get a larger role, it's not going to be as a coverage linebacker that you trust in all situations, I don't think. Maybe they envision that for Holcomb, even though his coverage grades haven't been great either. But he's got a little bit, he's a little taller. I think he's 6'1", a little more athletic, at least his pedigree coming out of North Carolina. Blew it up at his pro day 5 years ago now. So if not him, then yeah, I think that's where you have to look at in this draft. Jack Campbell, he's a difficult evaluation. He's 6'5", and he's an Iowa guy where they all kind of play in a phone booth there, right? So, so I don't know that he would be a great addition. Trenton Simpson's really athletic, coming from Clemson, but I think there are some coverage concerns with him as well. And Drew Sanders is another bigger guy. Henley's interesting. He's a former wide receiver converted to linebacker, so he should have a little bit of that mirroring ability when you talk about matching up with tight ends or even occasionally slot receivers if you get thrown into that role. Henry To'o from Alabama is another name that I think is somewhat intriguing. He's not a bigger guy. If he shows that he can run, maybe that's somebody that'll be on their radar in the middle rounds. But I don't think they have to add necessarily to this group through the draft. I think they've made some moves to fill holes there. It's not as big of a need as it was going into free agency. It's just going to be a matter of, can they finally hit on a couple of these veteran evaluations? They've tried and failed with the likes of John Bostic and Joe Schobert and Avery Williamson and Mark Barron. So it'll be, in Miles Jack, most recent. It'll be curious to see, do they continue to use these guys in the same roles, or could they take a step back, Mike Tomlin, Terrell Austin, the brain trust, and say, how much do we want to revamp things defensively? Can we start using Terrell Edmonds if we re-sign him in a role like that? What can we kind of do with our nickel and dime sub packages to limit the exposure of these linebackers? Those would be much more schematic changes, but you've got to adapt to your personnel. The old paint the barn red adage that Mike Tomlin likes to espouse so often.
No, I agree. I think the best coaching is the kind of coaching that warps their coaching around the players that they have. They try to raise them up, do try to make them better, but also recognize when you are trying to teach an old dog new tricks, or trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. But I think we're both on the same page here. There's a lot of doors the Steelers could open with this NFL draft class, and what the Steelers have done in free agency has allowed them to kind of look at, like, okay, cornerback, you don't necessarily need a quarterback right away to just field a team this year, but you'd like to get one because you'd like a younger guy to be on your roster who could maybe become the torch-bearing, like we represent, the good Steelers cornerbacks of the future. You don't necessarily need a linebacker, with your first or second pick, but you'd like one to have a young guy who could, pick up wherever Cole Holcomb and Elandon Roberts eventually leaved off. Defensive line, even, I'd say, you signed Larry Ogunjobi, great, and you have him and Cam Hayward, and you have DeMarvin Leal coming back, but you still want to find out who's going to be the next big bruiser of the defensive line in the Steelers history. And I think that's what's very interesting is
All those
now.
positions, Chris, are structured now in somewhat of a similar way. Like in the corner group, Patrick Peterson is your vet. Levi Wallace is kind of your in-between guy. Anakella Witherspoon, if you want to put him in there. And then James Pierre is like your lottery ticket. He just re-signed on Tuesday. Linebacker, Cole Holcomb, I think is, he's clearly the guy right now. Elandon Roberts is in that middle tier. And then Mark Robinson is your late round flyer. And then on the D line, Cam Hayward is, kind of aging out to some extent, but Larry Ogunjobi and DeMarvin Leal are in the middle there. And then you've got Isaiah Loudermilk, who's like kind of on the periphery, not somebody you're going to bank on. Maybe you think you can upgrade. So that's a good point that, I think all those groups are in a similar bucket as we go into the draft, but positional value wise, I mean, corner and D line are much higher in most years, I would say, than inside linebacker.
Right. And I think that's where the Steelers could look at and say, hey, we can go these directions. But again, I think this is the situation they put themselves in. Is they are not when we'll talk about their pro day visits in the next segment. But you've covered the Steelers in years past where it was like last year they're looking at quarterbacks. They're going to probably take a quarterback. The year before that, they're looking at running backs. They're probably going to take Najee Harris. Not even running backs. They're probably going to take Najee Harris. There's been years when, it's been kind of predictable. I mean, heck, the story about, the Bengals jumping ahead of them to get William Jackson III way back in, what was that, 2016 NFL draft?
Yeah.
They've been in positions where it's kind of been like, hey, there's a specific need that we didn't get to address in free agency, so now we're going to go out and do that. And that's how the Steelers, they think sometimes. And
I think they've also tried to get away from that, too, in recent years. Like, yes. Last season, Montravius Adams, they re-sign him, and it's kind of like, all right, he's not necessarily a starter type of player, but he makes it less obvious that they have to go use an early pick on a D lineman. Yeah. Or, a couple years ago, signing Dante Moncrief made it a little less that you had to go get a receiver immediately. They still drafted one early in the third round with Deontay Johnson, but it allowed themselves to be in a position where, they could go by the player's talent or value rather than anything else. So I think that's what I'm seeing right now with this roster. Even tackle, you've got two starters coming back there, so it's not imperative that you go draft one in the first round. I think they've set themselves up to be in a position here where they can build a draft board in Andy Weidl's first season as assistant GM, that they can give guys pretty much true grades and basically stick to it as the first round plays out that Thursday night, and let their highest graded player fall to them and not feel like they have to reach for a certain position over another one.
I think that's certainly what they're going to do. And I think it'll be interesting to see where linebacker falls in that. And there's also the very real situation where they get to the draft and they realize, well, we didn't get the guys that we thought we could at these positions. Let's go and sign this person who's still available in free agency.
They did that last year with Larry Ogunjobi, I would say.
Exactly, the Ogunjobi, and not that an Ogunjobi pops up every year, where a guy who was originally signed to a really good contract, failed his physical, and then eventually he was available to you. Not that that's going to be a thing, but there are still free agents that are out there that I think will be out there after the NFL draft, and something that the Steelers could take a look at. And again, not as game changer type of guys, but got depth guys who, like Roberts, like Holcomb, could bring in solid experience and help you kind of just not have major liabilities at those positions. But of course, they want to hit on their players in the NFL draft so that they don't have to worry about that as much. But who are they visiting on their pro days? Now that the combine's done, all the colleges are rolling out their pro days. The Steelers have made several visits with their top brass, and usually those are signs of where they're looking in the first round. We'll talk about all their visits right here in the North Shore Drive podcast. Chris Carter and Brian Batko. We'll be right back. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Brian Batko, our Steelers beat writer. Brian, let's talk about these pro days visits the Steelers have been on. It's been a rush to see all the teams they've been to, but they've been to Clemson, where they got to see Brian Brzee and Trenton Simpson. They went to Georgia, where they got to see Broderick Jones, Darnell Washington, Jalen Carr, everybody. At Georgia just has so many talented guys. They've been to Michigan, They've been to both Iowa and Iowa State, and of Wednesday, they've also visited Ohio State. And now you're seeing across the board, like, okay, they're getting looks at these different guys. I think this goes back to what we were saying, that this isn't an obvious, like, here's where they're looking type of situation. But of those schools, there's a lot of interesting players that you could pick out. Lucas Van Ness from Iowa. You could pick out, of course, at Michigan, Mazai Smith, a defensive line prospect there. Trenton Simpson, a linebacker out of Clemson. But to me, Broderick Jones and Darnell Washington are a very interesting group of guys that they could get either of if they were able to fall down to them.
And Keely Ringo, who I think is a prospect who people are kind of all over the board. That's somebody you'd want to get a little up close look and probably spend some time with to figure out, are you a project, or are you somebody who can play right away?
Yeah, exactly. And I just wanted to get a sense from you. Are there you've been keeping an eye on the draft, keeping an eye on the Steelers, and kind of messing around with mock drafts. Is there anybody that you think that is that went to those schools that you think that these could be the guys that the Steelers are actually going to look at while everyone's talking about each school's biggest star?
Yeah, I guess, the Iowa schools stand out because, and I don't think this is some sort of like mystical deal. I think the Steelers probably get the pro day schedule in early March or whatever and decide, all right, on this day, this is the school that has the most guys who are draft worthy. If it's a day where there isn't one, then, you kind of just decide who has the best player that day. So, Iowa State being there on Tuesday, I think there's really one guy firmly on the radar, Will McDonald, edge rusher. I think he's probably a second or third round type of guy, but I'm starting to see some buzz for him going in the first. I don't think the Steelers would use a day one or maybe even necessarily day two pick on an edge rusher when they've got TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith, but it doesn't hurt to do your due diligence on him. If there were really no other schools popping off the page that day and you were just there in the state the day before at Iowa. And speaking of the Hawkeyes, I don't think that they were just out there to eat corn or whatever people eat. What do people eat in Iowa? I guess corn, is that more of a Nebraska thing?
I think that is more of a Nebraska thing. Were you just anti-Iowan?
No, I don't have anything against Iowa, but I just don't know what they're, like if they were in Wisconsin, I'd say they're not just there to eat cheese. Or if they were scouting the Idaho Vandals, I would say, okay, what do we got?
I just Googled food Iowa is famous for. Iowa is known for sour cream raisin pie. What in the world is that?
Close that tab immediately. Close that tab. Actually, throw your computer in the trash.
I'm just kidding. When this show's over with sour cream. If someone is listening to this show, please Twitter us something. I am out of no. We're never going to. I'm so glad that I didn't have to cover March Madness in Des Moines, Iowa, where I would have had to try this.
Is this an elaborate internet prank?
It has to be. I'm gonna try this again. Food. This is gonna do the same thing. But oh my gosh. Anyways.
Okay, so they weren't there to eat sour cream raisin pie. I'm pretty confident of that. What?
Scotcheroos. Iowa ham balls, Scotcheroos, made right sandwiches, made MAID right sandwiches, steak de burgo, taco pizza, Snickers salad. What is going on in Iowa?
Wow. Okay, I didn't think we'd be going down this path.
We have gone off the rails about a food that Iowa is famous for. But back to the point, there are some good players there that the Steelers are looking at.
Yeah, assuming they weren't there to eat ham balls, they were probably there to see the draft eligible players from the Iowa Hawkeyes. Lucas Van Ness, I mean, you have to think he's been on the Steelers' radar since the great Ray Fittipaldi mocked him to them in his first iteration of a mock draft this year. And yeah, he could be that 5 technique to replenish the depth in the defensive line pipeline. The other guy, and we mentioned Jack Campbell earlier. I mean, he's an inside linebacker named Jack who plays in black and gold. So you have to think there's some connection. Yeah, some cosmic connection to him. But the other guy I think is kind of under the radar, and he's in, maybe definitely not the first tier, maybe not even the second tier of corners in this draft. But Riley Moss is somebody who, was a pretty good player at the collegiate level. He's got a good athletic score, and we know the Steelers, they like to look at those SPARQ scores, the RAS, relative athletic scores, and he did pretty well for himself at the combine. As I recall, he's somebody who almost came out this time a year ago, but returned for his final season of eligibility. So if it doesn't work out to where they get a corner in the first, second, maybe even the third round, because say they go D-line, tackle, receiver, or inside linebacker or something like that, maybe Riley Moss could be on their radar based on what they did or didn't see at Iowa's Pro Day.
That's a very interesting aspect to look at there. Let's talk about Ohio State for a second here.
Yeah.
They're a group that always has a lot of guys the Steelers look at. Of course, you have Cam Hayward, who loves to lead that. Now, a lot of people are going to talk about C.J. Stroud. Of course, the Steelers are way out on him. But players the Steelers could be looking at it are Paris Johnson, the offensive tackle, though a lot of people have him slated to go long before the Steelers get a chance to pick, but you never know. Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think he ran in the 4.5s in his 40-yard dash when he was there. But he's not necessarily a blazer. He's more of a slot guy who's going to be really quick, cut you up, and get open. Also, offensive tackle DeJuan Jones, another guy who's going to be he's the lesser liked of the Paris, compared to Paris Johnson, but still someone that everyone's looking at. There's Zach Harrison and Luke, the edge rusher, Luke Weipler, the center. There's a lot of different options the Steelers could look at there. Is there one that reasonably ticks your interest as far as this is someone the Steelers could not only be interested in, but could actually fall to them in a reasonable spot that would make sense?
Yeah, I mean, DeJuan Jones, we've talked about him a lot because, he went crazy at the Senior Bowl. Everybody loved what they were seeing out of the big man down there in Mobile. The wingspan measurement, got his name out there. And then from what I've heard, he did pretty well in the drills. So he's probably a right tackle only prospect. But the more that you look at these guys up close, in person, and it's not just what they're seeing, Chris, at these pro days. NFL folks, the coaches, the scouts, they're going around and they're beating up the ears of the assistants at these programs, quality control coaches, behind the scenes, player personnel staffers. They want to, get as much intel as they can while they're on the ground. And, if you continue to, pull at the thread of DeJuan Jones, his position flexibility or lack thereof, that could be a big pivot point for his stock. Luke Weipler, the center, he's interesting because I think with the Steelers, based on everything they've done at the interior offensive line positions in free agency, I don't think they're going to draft one. But if they did, it would make sense to get, a center in training behind Mason Cole. And maybe that's a pick that's there in late third or early fourth round for you. He's also from New Jersey, so they could have a nice Jersey pipeline up the middle, center QB, Luke Weipler and Kenny Pickett. And then, just the last guy that I'll mention is Zach Harrison, who reminds me a little bit of Liao in the sense that this time a year ago, you were always seeing him in the way too early 2023 mock drafts because he's big, he can move really well. Yeah, he's got that length. He just didn't produce much at Ohio State. And I think he actually took some criticism from, a former player or two that are basically like, we've got this guy who's on draft boards, but why isn't he getting more than 4.5 sacks in a season or whatever his final numbers ended up being? So if he slips because of those concerns about his competitive nature or his motor or just not being able to get it done against Big Ten tackles, then maybe he gets to a point where you say, okay, we can do a lot worse than getting a developmental defensive end in here who maybe we can mold him into something, even if he was a bit of a disappointment in his college career.
I think the Steelers, they've done that a few times. I think DeMarvin Leal's, the kind of a guy whose build is a bit different, which is why he lines up on the outside a little bit more often than your average rookie defensive lineman. But who knows? Mike Tomlin says he loves guys who bring multiples in his way of saying versatility. But the Steelers are going to keep looking at guys who do that. We'll keep track of everyone who they do visit on the pro days and keep you up to date with all their NFL draft options moving forward. But that's what we have here for you today from the North Shore Drive podcast. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. Anything that you got coming out that we need to tell Steelers fans to look out for at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette?
Yeah, I mean, Friday, Steelers mailbag. I've been doing those probably more like every other week now that we're into the off season, but should have some good questions, some good stuff to bat around this week from the readers. And I'll just, put it on the radar now. A week from today, if you're listening to this on Wednesday, Pitt will have their annual pro day on the south side at the UPMC Rooney Sports Complex. So I'm sure I will find my way down there with you, and I'm sure Noah will be there too. Chris, and we can have a nice little meeting of the minds in person.
Absolutely. I'm sure that'll produce some really great content as we find out. One thing we'll never find out, though, is what a sour cream raisin pie tastes like. I'm never going to do that to myself. Iowa, get your lives together. What are you doing out there in Des Moines? Anyways, thanks again for checking out the North Shore Drive podcast from Chris Carter and Brian Batko. Check out all the Post-Gazette content at post-gazette.com, and also check out this show Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as all of our Pittsburgh Post-Gazette video and audio content that you can find on your favorite podcasting app, and especially on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of that Pittsburgh Post-Gazette content. I'll be back Friday recapping the week on what happened with the rest of the Steelers week, and maybe we'll get some look at other things going around in Pittsburgh sports as well. We'll see you then right here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you're watching this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down below in the description.